The Last Witch Trial, Helen Duncan and the Wartime Supernatural. Fog blankets the streets of London as air raid sirens pierce the night. It's 1944, at the height of World War II. Sturdy middle-aged woman is dragged from a house in Portsmouth by police officers. Her crime isn't espionage or treason, but something far more unexpected: practicing witchcraft. Not in some medieval court, but in 20th century England. While Britain fought for survival against Nazi forces, its government resurrected a medieval law to silence a Scottish medium whose revelations were deemed a threat to national security. This story isn't just about a woman accused of witchcraft in modern times. It represents the collision of seemingly incompatible worlds, the rational and mystical, national security and the supernatural, law and spiritualism. Helen Duncan, a medium with controversial abilities, became the center of a political and spiritual storm that exposed the depths of institutional fear when confronted with the unexplainable. How did a woman of humble origins become so dangerous that the British government had to unearth the Witchcraft Act of 1735 to stop her? What did she know that posed such a threat? And why does her case continue to fascinate occult scholars and historians, almost 8 decades later? Our early life and spiritual awakening. Helen McFarland was born on November 25, 1897, in Callander, Perthshire, Scotland, the daughter of a stonemason. She grew up in modest circumstances at a time when the spiritualist movement was gaining extraordinary momentum throughout Britain. From a young age, Helen displayed unusual abilities that intrigued and sometimes frightened those around her. Mediumship is a natural gift. Like blue eyes or curly hair, wrote Arthur Conan Doyle, creator of Sherlock Holmes and a fervent advocate for spiritualism. It cannot be acquired, only developed. This was precisely Helen's case. Contemporaries reported that even as a child, she demonstrated the ability to predict events and described deceased individuals she had never met. At 24, Helen married Henry Duncan, a cabinet maker with whom she had 6 children. Life was hard for this working-class Scottish family, especially during the economically challenging interwar period. In this context of financial hardship, Helen began to explore her mediumistic abilities more seriously. Professor Hans Holzer, a renowned parapsychologist, noted in his studies that mediumship often flourishes in conditions of material deprivation, as if the veil between worlds becomes thinner when earthly concerns intensify. This observation seems to describe Helen Duncan's trajectory precisely. The controversial medium. Around 1926, Helen began holding séances at her home, initially for friends and family. The most notable phenomenon in these sessions was the production of ectoplasm, a white misty substance that supposedly emanated from her body during trance states. This ectoplasm, according to witnesses, often took on recognizable human forms, so-called materialized spirits. Ectoplasm is the physical bridge between our world and the beyond, wrote French psychic researcher Gustave Gallet. It is the tangible manifestation of the intangible. For Helen's followers, these manifestations were undeniable proof of consciousness surviving death. For her detractors, they were elaborate tricks. Controversy around Helen intensified when the London Psychic Laboratory, an institution dedicated to investigating paranormal phenomena, invited her for a series of tests in 1931. The results were disastrous for her reputation. Harry Price, the lab's director and a well-known skeptic, claimed to have found evidence of fraud. According to his report, the supposed ectoplasm was actually a mixture of gauze, paper, and egg whites that Helen regurgitated during sessions. The line between charlatanism and genuine phenomena is often thin in the realm of mediumship, reflected esoteric philosopher Colin Wilson. Even authentic mediums may resort to tricks when their abilities fail, which doesn't necessarily mean all their manifestations are fraudulent. This insight is especially relevant in Helen Duncan's case. Despite fraud accusations, she maintained a loyal following who testified to phenomena they believed were beyond explanation. Among them was Hannon Swaffer, a prominent British journalist and spiritualist who declared, "I observed Helen Duncan under controlled conditions. What I saw cannot be explained by any theory of fraud." In 1933, Helen faced her first serious run-in with the law. She was prosecuted for fraud under the Vagrancy Act and sentenced to 1 month of hard labor. Far from ending her career as a medium, this conviction only strengthened her resolve. In the years that followed, She traveled extensively throughout Britain, conducting seances in private homes and small halls. Psychiatrist Carl Jung, in his studies on paranormal phenomena, observed, the collective unconscious often manifests knowledge that transcends the physical limitations of time and space. This perspective offers an alternative interpretation of Helen's abilities, not necessarily as communication with the dead, but as a form of extrasensory perception tuned into the collective unconscious. Now the war years and national security. When World War II erupted in September 1939, Britain quickly found itself immersed in the most devastating conflict in modern history. Amid rationing, bombings, and the constant threat of invasion, a curious phenomenon emerged, a resurgence of interest in occultism and spiritual practices. In times of collective crisis, the barrier between the mundane and the mystical often dissolves, observed religious historian Mircea Eliade. Human beings confronted with the fragility of existence turned to the transcendent in search of comfort and meaning. For thousands of Britons who had lost loved ones in the war, spiritualist seances offered something no government agency could provide: the possibility of one last communication, a farewell, a confirmation that their loved ones continued to exist on some other plane. Helen Duncan, with her established reputation as a physical medium, found herself at the center of this spiritual demand. Her seances, held in darkened rooms in Portsmouth, Southampton, Edinburgh, and dozens of other cities, drew crowds desperate for contact with sons, husbands, and brothers lost on battlefields, in the skies over England or in the depths of the Atlantic. It was in Portsmouth, a major British naval base, that Helen's work took on an unexpected and potentially dangerous dimension. During a séance in November 1941, witnesses reported that the materialized spirit of a sailor appeared, identifying himself as belonging to the HMS Barham, a British battleship. This spirit, according to those present, declared that his ship had been sunk. The problem was that the HMS Barham had indeed been torpedoed by a German submarine on November 25 of that year, resulting in the deaths of 861 sailors. But this information was a tightly held military secret. The Admiralty had deliberately withheld news of the sinking to maintain public morale and to avoid providing the enemy with intelligence about the effectiveness of their attacks. Dennis Wheatley, author of occult novels who worked for British intelligence during the war, wrote in his memoirs, "The security of information was considered as vital as the safety of the troops themselves. A leak could cost countless lives." Within this regime of strict secrecy, Helen Duncan's revelations were a disturbing anomaly. How could a working-class medium with no connections to military high command or access to classified intelligence know about a naval disaster kept under wraps? This question haunted British authorities. Aleister Crowley, the infamous occultist who also collaborated with British intelligence during the war, remarked in a letter to an associate, "The real danger of mediums like Duncan is not if they are frauds, but if they are not. If she can truly access information by non-conventional means, then she poses a security risk that no code or safe can contain." And it wasn't just the HMS Barham. According to contemporary reports, Helen revealed details of several other military operations before they were made public. In one particularly striking incident, she allegedly materialized the spirit of a soldier who had died during Operation Torch, the Allied landings in North Africa, days before the operation was officially announced. Writer and psychic researcher Leslie Flint commented, "If we accept these reports as true, we are forced to consider that either Helen Duncan had extraordinary sources of information, which seems unlikely given her social position, or that her mediumistic gifts allowed her to access knowledge that transcended normal limitations of time and space." To British intelligence services, already hyper-vigilant against spies and saboteurs, Helen represented a perplexing enigma. MI5, Britain's internal security service, began discreetly monitoring her activities. Undercover agents attended her seances, compiling detailed reports on her behavior. A document declassified years after the war reveals the confusion within intelligence circles. Subject continues to reveal classified information with no apparent source. Investigation into possible contacts with naval or intelligence personnel has revealed no significant links. Given the popularity of her seances among military families, the potential for security compromise remains high. Lies the raid and arrest In January 1944, authorities finally took action. During a séance in Portsmouth, police raided the premises, arresting Helen and several attendees. The lights were abruptly switched on, exposing Helen in an alleged trance, while an officer attempted to grab what he described as a white figure that quickly vanished. Initially, Helen was detained on relatively minor charges under the Vagrancy Act, essentially the accusation of pretending to have psychic powers to obtain money. However, as the case progressed, the authorities made a surprising decision. They chose to prosecute Helen Duncan under the Witchcraft Act of 1735. Psychic researcher Maurice Barbanel wrote at the time, "The decision to resurrect an archaic law against witchcraft says more about the desperation of the authorities than about the nature of Helen Duncan's activities." Unable to explain how she obtained classified information, they resorted to legislation from an era that still believed in pacts with the devil. This decision transformed what could have been an obscure case of fraud into a historic trial that captured the imagination of the British public and raised profound questions about the relationship between the state, science, and the supernatural in the 20th century. The trial, science, law and the supernatural. On March 23, 1944, as Allied forces prepared for the imminent invasion of Normandy, an extraordinary legal spectacle unfolded at the Old Bailey, London's Central Criminal Court. Helen Duncan, a robust 47-year-old Scottish woman, stood in the dock accused of violating the Witchcraft Act of 1735, a piece of legislation few legal scholars even realized was still in force. Professor Ronald Hutton, a historian specializing in paganism and witchcraft, noted, "The trial of Helen Duncan represents a fascinating collision between modernity and tradition. In the age of atomic bombs and radar, a woman was being prosecuted under a law designed for a society that genuinely believed in witches. The prosecution, led by barrister John Maud, did not claim that Helen flew on broomsticks or cast curses, the medieval notions of witchcraft. Instead, she was specifically accused of pretending to summon the spirits of the dead, a modern interpretation of an ancient law. Sir Gerald Dodson, the presiding judge, made his position clear from the outset. This court is not concerned with whether the spirits of the dead can or cannot communicate with the living. The question is whether the accused attempted to deceive the public into believing she could." The trial lasted 7 days, an extraordinarily long period for an apparently minor case, especially during wartime. More than 40 witnesses were called, an impressive number that included both supporters and critics of Helen. Among the defense witnesses were respectable individuals who swore they had clearly recognized deceased relatives materialized in Helen's séances. One man with a trembling voice described how his late mother appeared and called him by a childhood nickname that only she knew. A war widow recounted how her husband appeared with specific details about his death that she would only officially confirm. Weeks later, the sworn testimony of respectable citizens who claimed to have experienced the supernatural places. The court, in a philosophically complex position, wrote philosopher C.M. Joad in a contemporary article, "Either we must conclude that dozens of people are collectively committing perjury, or that our understanding of reality must make room for currently inexplicable phenomena." The prosecution, on the other hand, focused on discrediting Helen's mediumistic phenomena. A crucial moment came when experts demonstrated how gauze soaked in egg white, once swallowed, could be regurgitated to simulate ectoplasm, a technique Harry Price had accused Helen of using years earlier. Spiritualist physician Dr. Nandor Fodor, who had extensively studied materialization phenomena, later wrote, "The question is not whether some mediums resort to fraud when their powers fail, many do, but whether all observed phenomena can be explained by such methods." The most compelling cases reported from Duncan's séances involve manifestations that could hardly be replicated by simple sleight of hand. A fascinating dimension of the trial was the authorities' reluctance to directly address the issue of national security, although it was widely speculated that the government's real concern was Helen's ability to reveal classified military information. This aspect was never explicitly mentioned during the proceedings. Prime Minister Winston Churchill reportedly referred to the case in private as medieval nonsense. Sonu Shamdasani, historian of psychology and the occult, observed, The trial represents a moment when the British legal and military establishment confronted a phenomenon that didn't fit into existing categories of threat. Unable to prosecute her as a spy since there was no evidence of enemy contact, they turned to an archaic law that at least offered some mechanism for containing what they perceived as danger. As the trial progressed, it became clear that the case was about far more than the guilt of a single medium. It was a referendum on the limits of scientific knowledge, on the relationship between the state and unconventional spiritual practices, and on the very nature of reality, the verdict and aftermath. On April 3, 1944, the jury returned its verdict after only 30 minutes of deliberation: guilty. Helen Duncan was sentenced to 9 months in Holloway Prison, a surprisingly harsh sentence for a non-violent offense during wartime. The verdict sparked immediate controversy. Maurice Barbonell, editor of the spiritualist newspaper Psychic News, wrote, "Today, the British state has declared illegal the fundamental belief of spiritualism, that the dead can communicate with the living. Millions of spiritualists now find themselves technically in violation of the law simply for practicing their religion." The Spiritualist National Union organized protests, arguing that the verdict amounted to religious persecution. A petition with thousands of signatures was sent to the Home Office requesting Helen's release. Helen served her sentence with dignity. According to reports, a fellow inmate later revealed that even the prison guards often consulted Helen about deceased loved ones. After her release in 1945, with the war already over, she vowed to continue her mediumistic work, a promise she kept until her death in 1956. Paradoxically, the trial that sought to silence Helen Duncan ended up turning her into a martyr for the spiritualist cause and secured her place in history as the last person convicted of witchcraft in England. The case also hastened the repeal of the Witchcraft Act, which was finally replaced by the Fraudulent Mediums Act in 1951, a law that clearly distinguished between deliberate fraud and genuine religious practice. The trial of Helen Duncan remains a powerful reminder of how even in societies that consider themselves rational and enlightened, the fear of the unknown can resurrect deeply rooted repressive impulses. Legacy and modern interpretations. After her release from Holloway Prison in 1945, Helen Duncan emerged not only as a free citizen, but as a living symbol of the tension between dominant scientific materialism and the enduring esoteric traditions at the heart of modernity. Far from abandoning her mediumistic practices after the trauma of trial and imprisonment, Helen resumed her work with renewed determination. Those who have crossed the veil between worlds and returned can rarely be content with the limitations of a purely material perspective, wrote the mystic Thomas Merton. This observation seems to perfectly capture Helen Duncan's post-trial trajectory. In the following years, she conducted hundreds of séances across Britain. Now a celebrity in the international spiritualist world, her demonstrations attracted even larger crowds. Ironically, the trial that aimed to discredit her had significantly amplified her fame. Manly P. Hall, renowned scholar of the occult, observed, "In the history of esoteric traditions, persecution often serves as an involuntary form of validation. When powerful institutions mobilize against an individual who claims to access knowledge beyond the accepted paradigm, it paradoxically suggests that this individual poses a threat precisely because there is something genuine in their claims." In November 1956, the final chapter in Helen Duncan's extraordinary life unfolded. During a séance in Nottingham, police once again raided the location where she was conducting a mediumistic demonstration. Though this time authorities invoked the newer Fraudulent Mediums Act, the pattern of persecution was painfully familiar. Witnesses reported that Helen, in a deep trance at the moment of the raid, suffered a severe shock. When officers attempted to seize the supposed ectoplasm, she experienced a crisis that resulted in internal bleeding. 5 weeks later, on December 6, 1956, Helen Duncan died at the age of 59. At her funeral, renowned journalist and spiritualist Hannah Swaffer declared,
"Helen Duncan gave her life for the truth of spiritualism.
Just as surely as any religious martyr in history, a contemporary relevance. Beyond biographical narrative, the case of Helen Duncan continues to resonate in contemporary esoteric studies for several profound reasons. One is the still unanswered question. How did she acquire information? She seemingly could not have known. Dr. Dean Radin, a researcher of seaside phenomena at the Institute of Noetic Sciences, proposes historical cases like Helen Duncan compel us to consider the possibility of non-local modes of information access. Quantum mechanics has shown that particles can be entangled and influence each other instantly across vast distances. Perhaps consciousness operates under similar principles that we do not yet fully understand. This perspective echoes psychiatrist Carl Jung's writings on synchronicity, events seemingly connected, without a discernible causal link, and his theory of the collective unconscious as a repository of shared memory and experience. Researcher Rupert Sheldrake, with his theory of morphic fields, suggests individuals who are particularly sensitive may, in altered states of consciousness, access information fields that transcend conventional limits of time and space. What we call mediumship may be a natural, though rare, form of connection with these fields. Perhaps the deepest lesson of Helen Duncan's case is that the boundaries between the possible and impossible, the natural and supernatural, are not fixed but culturally determined and historically contingent. As philosopher Michel Foucault noted, every era has its regime of truth, systems of power that sanction certain types of knowledge, while relegating others to obscurity. In that context, individuals like Helen Duncan serve as liminal figures, occupying spaces between conceptual worlds, defying easy categorization, and pointing to possibilities that our dominant paradigms struggle to accommodate. Decades after her death, as emerging fields like quantum physics, consciousness studies, and anomaly research continue to expand our understanding of the possible, the extraordinary case of Helen Duncan, the last person convicted under a witchcraft law in England, remains a powerful reminder of the mysteries that still lie at the heart of human experience. As the famous occultist Dion Fortune once wrote, "Magic is the art of causing changes in consciousness according to will." Seen through this lens, perhaps Helen Duncan's true legacy lies, not so much in her supposed gift of speaking with the dead, but in her ability to challenge the boundaries of conventional thought, inviting us to consider realities beyond the narrow confines of the scientific materialism that dominates our age.